So the topic for this week is death and the afterlife in the Middle Ages. This is the first of the four horsemen, or actually in the book of Revelation, this is the fourth of the four horsemen, but here we're treating it first because in a way, death is the thing that links together the other horsemen, right? That plague or pestilence and famine and war all lead to death, and so it makes sense either to treat this first or last, and in this case we're going to do it first. And there's several aspects of death and the afterlife in the Middle Ages that I want to discuss here. This is by no means comprehensive. There are lots of other topics that we could bring up, and if you feel so inclined, please feel free to raise questions on discussion boards and in live classes and those sorts of things. If you want to ask questions about other aspects of death or the afterlife that we may not cover over the next few video lectures here. I want to start with a kind of conceptual analysis or just some conceptual talk about death, generally speaking, right? And to do this, I want to turn to the words of Shakespeare, specifically to Hamlet's soliloquy in Act 3, Scene 1 of Hamlet. This is the most famous speech possibly that Shakespeare ever wrote. It's the to be or not to be speech, right? And in that soliloquy, Hamlet, who is in a difficult situation in his life at that time, if you know the story of Hamlet, or if you don't, let me give you kind of just a brief description of it. Hamlet is a prince. His father dies under mysterious circumstances. Turns out he was murdered by his brother, and the brother ends up kind of seizing control of the throne and marrying Hamlet's newly widowed mother. Hamlet is passed over, and then his father's ghost kind of appears to him and tells him that he was murdered by his brother and asks Hamlet, or commands Hamlet really, to seek revenge. And Hamlet is kind of waffling between, whether he should take revenge for his father or if he should just think that he's going crazy and seeing ghosts and these sorts of things. And at some point in Hamlet, I think, if we were to diagnose him or say, what is Shakespeare actually treating here? We'd have to say that Hamlet is mentally ill, right? He is suffering from maybe severe depression, possibly some other mental disorders, but he starts to contemplate very seriously killing himself. And the to be or not to be speech, although it is sometimes used to inspire, to be or not to be, well, I'm going to take charge of the situation. That's not really what Hamlet's saying there. He's saying to be or not to be. In other words, should I continue to live or should I die? Should I kill myself? Right? And he says, if I could ensure that death were just a dreamless sleep. He doesn't say it in that many words, but that death were the finality of it, then I would gladly kill myself. But the problem is that I don't know. There may be something after this life, and this is what he calls the undiscovered country. But for the fear of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns puzzles the will, and I'm paraphrasing now, takes away our conviction to do great things, or our conviction perhaps to just end it, right? So the undiscovered country, what lies on the other side of death? Socrates had talked about this in the Apology. He basically gave two options for what death is. He said it's either a dreamless sleep, a sleep that you never wake up from, or it's a journey to another place where you continue to do the same things that you've been doing here. I think we can possibly envision a lot of other things that we could be doing after death. But the point of this is we don't know. And that's the thing, perhaps more than any other, right, that leads to consternation over death. Hamlet says, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. In other words, if I kill myself and it turns out there is a God and a heaven and a hell and all of this stuff about committing sins like suicide, right? If that's going to land me in a bad place for eternity, in other words, these are the dreams that may come, so to speak, then that's not a good thing. And that's why I lose my resolution to just end it. Why I can't just kill myself. Because there may be a life after this life, and God or whoever's in charge of that life may care about this. So I think that when we're thinking about death, we have to recognize that the uncertainty of it is a big part of the problem. In fact, that may be the sum total of the problem of this. This is why death was included as one of the four horsemen, one of these destructive forces. It's a thing that everyone fears. It's a thing that causes intense worry and consternation. We mourn those who die because we don't know what's happened to them. We mourn, or we fear the possibility of our own death because we don't know what that means for us. Like, will we continue to live? Will we perish forever? What awaits us after this life, right? Almost pretty much every civilization has worried a great deal about this, about what happens after, right? And various world religions have come up with different ideas for what happens, and the continuation or the cessation of life, and all of that. When we're talking about the Middle Ages specifically, we have to consider what the words of authority said about this, right? The words of authority, of course, are things like the Bible, the writings of the church fathers like St. Augustine and St. Jerome, and even the Greco-Roman tradition, which they knew, the great works of classical literature like Virgil's Aeneid, for instance. What do these things say about death and about the afterlife, right? And the dominant imagery that surrounds death is, and especially the afterlife, are these ideas of a kind of binary set of spaces that the dead inhabit. They either go to heaven or they go to hell. Hell being a terrible place, right? And this is characterized in different ways. Kind of the classic depiction of hell that becomes solidified in the Western mind is a place with lots of fire, with devils wielding pitchforks or other sharp instruments, tormenting those who live in hell, or who are consigned to hell, I should say. You're not really living there, I suppose. You're dead. But eternal torture and all of that. And then heaven being a nice place, right? Somewhere, and it just tends to be like imagery in the sky, on clouds, surrounded by angels in the presence of God, doing nice things. But recognize as well that the Greco-Roman view of this was also influential in the Middle Ages. That the information that we looked at in Virgil's Aeneid, for instance, descriptions of Elysium, right, and Tartarus, were influential in the way that thinkers in the Middle Ages, Christian thinkers, and perhaps even thinkers in the Jewish and Muslim faiths, who also read works of classical antiquity, the way they conceived of the afterlife, right? There's also this notion, and this is elaborated on a great deal, especially by St. Augustine, the most influential of the early church fathers, the notion of original sin, that death was only brought into the world by Adam and Eve, and that this was a kind of punishment, right? And this gave death a negative connotation. This sin led to death. There were, of course, in the Christian view of things, two kinds of death. There was the physical death or the death of the body, but there was also the death of the soul, which came as a consequence of sin, and thus necessitating Jesus to suffer for sins, to overcome original sin, and all of that. Right? This is the central kind of features of Christian theology. But original sin was, a sort of curse in this way, and that gave this further pejorative connotation to the idea of death. And so people in the Middle Ages, as in most ages, in most civilizations, devoted themselves a great deal to not only thinking about death, but coming up with rituals, with a whole apparatus of cultural forms that surrounded death. There was, for instance, a strong tradition of commemorating the dead in various ways, of even keeping lists of those who were dead and praying for their souls in the afterlife, of burial practices and liturgies or religious services that would be performed in connection with death, and periodic commemorations. I know there was a Christian feast day or holy day known as All Saints' Day, which is November 1st, for instance, right? Which is really sort of a commemoration, or it's a catch-all way of thinking about the dead, and this in various parts of the extended sort of European world. This is commemorated in various ways in sort of the Spanish sphere, and eventually in the Spanish colonies in America, like Mexico. We have the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, right, which happens on All Saints' Day. And this is actually the origin of Halloween, which is the eve of All Saints' Day, right? The eve of the All Hallows, when the dead are restless and roaming the earth somehow. And so they have to be appeased in a way, right? They have to be commemorated. Their memory has to be perpetuated over time, or they might they could potentially be a threat. Stemming from this is also the tradition of ghosts and ancestral spirits, and we find these in the ancient texts. We read about Aeneas visiting the underworld and seeing the dead, and there were lots of stories about ghosts and the summoning of the dead or undead, or mostly dead, or whatever it is, right? People from the other side of the living dead divide. That these kinds of stories were perpetuated in Greek and Roman literature. There's even traditions in the Bible of people conducting rituals that would allow them to communicate with the dead. The most famous of these probably is in the first book of Samuel, actually, where Saul it's not in the chapters that we read in this class, but Saul summons the spirit of the prophet Samuel after his death, and tries to communicate with him in a way. And so in the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Greco-Roman tradition, there are lots of stories told about ghosts and ancestral spirits, and these get perpetuated into the Middle Ages. There's always a concern that the dead might be restless, the dead could be potentially threatening, and they need to be appeased, they need to be remembered, and there's something to be feared for sure. And so death is a threat, not only, of course, to those who were living, but even the world of the dead is in a threatening space, and it bleeds over into the space of the living. At the same time, death has a utility to various institutions in the Middle Ages, the church being the most prominent of these. The church gets a whole lot of mileage out of the fear of death, right? Because in the view of the church, a lot of this, the whole point of one's mortal life is actually to prepare for death so that one has a good afterlife. And this is true, in many religions that are, certainly the monotheistic religions, but even some of the mystery religions of antiquity and some other religious forms, right, have a great deal of concern about death and lots of teachings surrounding death. And this preparation for death, even the handling of the services around the rituals around death, like as we see depicted in this manuscript painting here, right? The priest is saying, or a bishop or whoever this is saying prayers over, the dead. This seems to be a child who has died, and perhaps this is his father now burying the child in the earth. And, the church is sort of overseeing this whole ritual, which is intensely personal for the person who has lost a loved one, but the church is kind of the mediator of all of this. And so there is a utility to death. This is something that strengthens the authority of the church, and the theological claims that it's making. All right, so those are some of the considerations we need to keep in mind as we look at specific ideas, cultural forms, practices, and so forth and so on that surround the topic of death in the afterlife.